Andreas Krieg is a professor at King's College, joins us now from London. So Tillerson's in the region. What sort of proposals is he bringing?
Morning. Good question. I don't think he is not really bringing any proposals necessarily. He said up front that he's not coming as a mediator. He doesn't want to take away from the Kuwaiti Emir's position at the moment. What he's trying to do really is trying to find common ground of where possibly, areas of common interest where there's an overlap within the GCC where both or all countries can actually sit down and talk about. And I think this kind of the one thing where most states can agree on is probably the fight against extremism. What he has to do is probably consolidate a consensus about what extremism means, what terrorism means, and possibly go back to the 2013 and 2014 Riyadh Agreement and really carve out some of these issues and concepts that are in there, but are probably not very well defined. But he said he's just trying to, use the leverage of the United States, the ear that the United States still have in the region, in order to push them to try to find consensus. He's not there as a mediator.
How does that make sense? If he's there to help both sides find common ground, to push them towards consensus, isn't that mediation in all but name?
Well, he wants to be careful not to undermine the position of the Emir. I think the key problem with the US policy, as has been already since Donald Trump came into office, that there is no real strategy. There is a vision of what they want in the Middle East. They want a Middle East that is united against Iran, a Middle East that's united against ISIS, and they need the GCC as a key partner in it. They haven't really filled the gaps yet and translated this vision into a coherent strategy which will say what are the means and ways to actually achieve these ends. And I think that is a key problem. He's coming there without a really well-defined strategy and without a very well-defined stepping stones of what to do next. I think it's more about feeling the temperature, feeling the climate at the moment in the GCC, and seeing what kind of progress has been made in recent weeks, because progress has been made behind closed doors.
Is the US position becoming any clearer between the early tweets of Donald Trump and the early statements we had from the State Department and Pentagon, which seem to be on different pages?
Yes, I think we've seen a convergence of these different positions. The US is not as bipolar as they might have been 4 weeks ago. I think the White House, Donald Trump, has been quite calm about the crisis. He hasn't really gotten involved. It seems like that Tillerson has now a stronger mandate than he had 4 weeks ago to actually do something on the ground. And the US is trying to speak with more and more with one voice, realizing that obviously a disunited GCC is absolutely not in the US's interests. And I think Tillerson has now a lot more leverage than he used to have, and probably can use this more effectively. And the hope is obviously that Donald Trump will take a step back. And from what we've seen recently, Donald Trump has taken a step back. He hasn't been as vocal in his support for the Saudi-UAE alliance.
All right, good to get your analysis. Thanks so much, Andreas Krieg there.
Stop on his tour of the region. Let's speak to Andreas Krieg, who's a professor at King's College, London. He is live from London. Very good to have you with us, Andreas. So Rex Tillerson in Doha today. He was in Kuwait yesterday. He's heading to Saudi later. What do you think the Americans will be proposing specifically during this tour? What can they bring to the table?
Yeah, I think Rex Tillerson didn't come as a mediator necessarily, because he was really careful not to undermine the position of the Kuwaiti Emir, who is really the one who is guiding these entire talks. But I think what he's trying to do is, first of all, see where we've come over the last couple of days and week in terms of finding a potential way out of this crisis. I think there's been a lot of development behind the scenes in Saudi Arabia, particularly, and in Qatar, where there are certain points that they could possibly talk about. And one point, I think, where we have an overlap, and I think this is where Tillerson is going to start his talks, is probably the fight against extremism. What is needed here, though, is a much more clarified, less vague and less ambiguous approach towards terrorism, and actually say what terrorism actually means. And I think where all GCC countries can agree on is that they have to counter terrorist financing, that they have to counter radicalization, particularly in the area of jihadism, Al-Qaeda, Daesh. Where there is still a lot of discord and lack of consensus is whether the Muslim Brotherhood and related more moderate groups are actually terrorists. And I think that's where the United States will be very important.
And speaking, Andreas, of less clear, less ambiguous and less a lack of consensus, if you will, do you think the U.S. position is clearer now than it was in the early stages of this crisis when we heard different things from the Trump administration, the president tweeting one thing, the Pentagon and State Department saying something else? Are they speaking with one voice right now in Washington?
Not with one voice. It's still quite confusing. There's still the formal, the formal U.S. diplomacy is still run by the State Department. There's definitely an impact of the Defense Department as well. Mattis and Tillerson are still very important, and I think they should lead this. But at the same time, there's also this informal United States, and that is the White House. There's Jared Kushner, who is the advisor on the Middle East. They still have these informal relationships with the Middle East. So Tillerson is taking the lead. I think he's got more of a mandate now than he might have had a couple of weeks ago. But we shouldn't forget that there are still personal relationships of Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, with leaders in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and they think that still plays a role.
There's no denying, Andreas, I think that things really haven't gone to plan for the blockading countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. There have been miscalculations, even in the way the U.S. has responded, I think. And there's a lot of talk right now of the 2014 Riyadh agreement as a possible way out of this crisis. But the rhetoric on both sides has been so intense in this last month. It's very hard to see how they can reach some sort of middle ground, a middle compromise that will satisfy both parties in this crisis. Where do you see things heading? What's a way out, if you will?
Very good point. I think that the fact that they reduced the demands from 13 to a lot more vague 6 demands is already a step into the right direction. I think Qatar is more willing to agree on some of these issues. But if you look at the leaked material from the 2013-2014 Riyadh agreement, you realize that pretty much Qatar has followed suit. Qatar has really implemented this kind of agreement, and anything Qatar can do now is reassure that they will continue working with these demands that were in the Riyadh agreement. And I think that pretty much, I mean, the important thing is that both sides don't lose face, and I think for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it's important that they don't lose further face now. So they have to come to another agreement, which I think is going to be a Riyadh agreement point 2, if you will, just another affirmation that Qatar will not interfere, or that none of the GCC countries will interfere in the sovereignty of their neighbors. There will be, again, a peace on the Muslim Brotherhood. But what has to happen now is a lot more precise. It has to be less vague and say these are the different stepping stones that all sides have to take in order to implement policy. And that's the problem with the GCC. The GCC is always about ambiguity. It's always vague because they want all countries to agree on something. And if this kind of consensus is usually too vague. I would be quite thrilled if they would find something that is a lot more precise and down to earth. I think that is probably impossible. Right. But what it's important now is they find a consensus that everybody can sign off.
As always, very good to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you so much for joining us, Andreas Krieg of King's College London, live on the NewsHour with us.